Thank you, Michael. That introduction is going to fit in just nicely with my opening page, but not the way you think, and not to my benefit. I had the comical thought that I could describe myself as coming out of retirement to deliver this lecture. If I were more familiar with the world of sports, I could offer you an illustration, but I'm not, and so I don't have one. It's just sounded funny coming out of retirement. I've been retired for 2 years and enjoyed every moment. I have a shorter commute to my office these days. I ascend to what was previously a bedroom on the second floor. But I like to picture myself climbing a circular staircase to a castle turret, such as Rapunzel may have occupied. The tower is not ivory anymore, but it's mine. And when I go there, I don't find myself thinking, I have one more thing to write. I find myself thinking, I have 100 more things to read. This change of attitude is caused by the retirement, which I will try to explain to you with this image. I once heard that the word career is related to the word car. It means to go somewhere. But in the case of an academic, the travel is by hot air balloon. This is because one spends so many years in graduate school inflating the balloon. And upon launch, one sets sail across the mountains seeking a part of the map that looks deserted. No fame can be had if there are already footprints there. So one must reinflate the balloon and go on from article to article, lecture to lecture. But the balloon finally deflates completely at retirement, and only then does one discover this fact. The balloon has not been filled with hot air, but with hubris. I don't say this in an entirely negative way. If it's not an oxymoron, it's kind of a benign hubris. One even needs this kind of hubris to face the dissertation committee, to put oneself forward for a job, to say, yes, I'd like to be on that committee. Or, yes, I can teach a course on that subject. One needs it in order to submit that first article to a journal or a book to a publisher, or even to attend professional meetings like this one and play with senior members of the guild. But when the career deflates, one looks back with mild embarrassment at all the vain posturing, lecturing, and attempts to be clever, even perhaps facing an overgenerous introduction at some talk in some society. Diego de Estella has an insightful definition of a vain thing as, quote, that which filleth not the place where it is. And one's embarrassment is more than mild when inflated vainglory is turned to vanity. Augustine Baker calls it much and willing speaking. You all know someone who speaks much and all too willingly. And he says it commonly flows from an opinion that we can speak well and consequently out of a desire of gaining estimation from others by showing our wits and abilities. But as this morning's scripture reading from Ecclesiastes said, there's a time for being deflated and a time for being reinflated. So when the call came from the society, there was enough reinflation to carry my balloon from South Bend to Houston, and here I am. Had I received this invitation while my balloon was still fully inflated, I might have addressed the topic of liturgy and human imagination in a way more congruent with what I think the planners probably had in mind. You declare the topic to be how divine worship can be authentically open to imagination, whether we can use creativity in the arts to fix our gaze on God. A dozen years ago, I treated the theme of imagination by beginning with iconography. Since Christ is, quote, the God who became a face, in Gennadios Lemouris's arresting phrase, therefore iconography can write the uncircumscribable. God can be imaged. God can be faced. I'm trying for a pun there. It's not just standing face to face, but God can be faced. God is imaginable because imagination is the activity the mind performs with its images. But this time my approach is different because over these past years I've been reading exclusively in a group of writers whom I call theologians of liturgical abnegation. I have in mind Catholic spiritual writers between 1500 to 1900 who took seriously Christ's command that to follow him we must deny ourselves. I had hitherto avoided them during all my laps around the career racetrack because their talk of mortification, objection, nothingness seemed excessively stern and overly dramatic. But they became my new friends as I began to hear them in a different key. Orthodox asceticism had given me a different way of looking at liturgy. Liturgy is now giving me a different way of looking at Catholic abnegation. The East taught me the ascetical scent of liturgy, and this has allowed me to find a liturgical aroma in the theologians of liturgical abnegation. So I offer you an attempt to coordinate three concepts that are rarely synchronized: abnegation, liturgy, and apophasis. The interrelationship is somewhat perichoretic, meaning that each makes room for the other in various ways. This is not my paper today, but any one of these four could have been my paper today. For example, apophatic theology is a liturgical reaction to the sovereignty of God, which in turn causes a state of abnegation. Or, for example, theology becomes liturgical abnegation when we do not comprehend him, rather he comprehends us. Or, primary theology is found in the sacramental liturgy where God unveils his face, but he does so only to the person who embraces his own nothingness before God's supremacy. Or, fourth, the infinity of God, apophasis, reveals our nothingness, abnegation, and our nothingness makes us rejoice in God's infinity, liturgy. Somehow these three will link together, and your homework assignment is to think about this for a year, see whether the three organize themselves in your mind. I'm going to proceed in this way, only two steps. First, apophasis places limits on imagination. Second, imagination could be recovered if apophasis is interpreted by liturgical abnegation. I will warn you when I change from the first and start the second. First, the apophatic places limits on imagination. We don't want imagination to degrade into an uncontrolled state, such as Giovanni Bona warns about. The faculty called imagination, he says, has been much weakened by sin, and therefore is unwilling to be subject to reason, ever giddy, ever inconstant, and never remaining in the same state. Like a fugitive slave who quits home without leave, it hurries away and goes around the entire world before we can become aware of its flight. I can see that in past courses in the face of freshmen in the back row. Their imagination goes around the world before they even notice that they've left the classroom. One of the first apophatic descriptions I can recall was Augustine saying, "Si comprehendis, non est Deus." If you can comprehend it, it is not God. Does that also mean if you can imagine it, it is not God? John of the Cross seems to think so. Quote, "All that the intellect may comprehend, all that the will may be satisfied with, and all that the imagination may conceive is most unlike unto God and most disproportionate to him." Perceptions enter the mind through images, stimulate the imagination, take residence in memory, receive formation by both passive and active intellect, and then are put to use by reason. But imaginations born from finite creation are disproportionate to the apophatic God. Face the fact. There's a solid ontological gap between ourselves and God, forcing Jean de Bernier-Louvigné to confess, "Oh my God, I elevate myself as much as I am able to find thee, and I discover that my being depends not on imagination or sense or reason, but that thou art above all incomprehensible. Juan de Castanitza says we should quit speechifying. I guess I should sit down, but I'm being paid, so. We should quit because so long as there are discourses going on in our understanding, images and fantasies in our memories, joys or tenderness in our will, these powers have not purely God, but sensible things for their object. Because God, being above all sensibility, must be found void of all creatures. As a result, the mystics famously speak of entering a darkness in which the soul knows nothing of God except that he is unknowable. And this itself, surprise, is happiness. According to Blosius, the soul, therefore, having entered the vast solitude of the Godhead, happily loses itself, and enlightened by the brightness of most lucid darkness, becomes through knowledge as if without knowledge, and dwells in a sort of wise ignorance. We discover in this darkness, as Abraham did, that liturgical abnegation is not mere ignorance, it is holy ignorance, which I propose might be not a bad definition of faith. Not ignorance, but holy ignorance. So Blosius concludes, the soul learns now by experience that God far transcends all bodily, spiritual, and divine images, as well as transcends the mind that can understand him, and whatever can be said or written about him, and whatever name can be given him. Alonso Rodriguez compares the little light and knowledge of God that reason can gain to a penny candle. Quote, but when God by himself and without the process of reasoning gives the soul this divine light, there's a greater difference between it and the light of reasoning than there is between the entire light of the sun and the light of one candle. But he adds that when God reaches us in this way, the soul knows by taste what it does not comprehend by intelligence. This is that mystical darkness. The soul knows by taste what it does not comprehend by intelligence. The less it understands God, the more ignorant it is of him, the sweeter the soul finds him. Many others also use this metaphor of taste. Bernardino de Laredo agrees that our unsearchable God is incomprehensible and incogitable, and therefore the highest perfection is touching that point of eternal wisdom which God in his good pleasure may deign to allow such souls to taste. And Francois Malival agrees that we cannot reduce God to any categories we could contrive. And even as we say the sovereign name, we must know that we cannot truly say it. The universal concept of beings is an idea which in a short time is no longer an idea, but a taste. The soul is taken beyond created species of sense, imagination, and reasoning into the uncreated one himself, who enraptures her. I don't know about you, but this seems to me to begin to sound like a good place for liturgy to reside. What's the problem? Liturgy is friendly to the apophatic. Liturgy trains the ear for the voice of God by an abnegation. That abnegation stifles self-speech, self-love, self-esteem, and vain imagination. The voice is most thunderously heard in silence, which communicates a different kind of knowledge. As Francois Fenelon describes, "Oh, how sweet is this voice! It makes all my entrails to leap for joy. Speak, O my spouse, and let none other venture to speak but thou alone. Be silent, O my soul, and speak thou, O love. I say that when we know all without knowing anything, at that point know all without knowing anything. 'Tis not that we have the presumption to think that we possess all truth in ourselves. No, quite the contrary. We are sensible that we see nothing, that we can do nothing, that we are nothing. We feel this, and we are ravished by it. Louis Chardon says that the divine fire places the soul in the abyss of love, and so greatly does this fire increase at times that it cancels out the attention of the other faculties of the soul, the intellect included. End quote. The imagination included, I add. So whatever imagination does, it must not objectify God, for he's not an object to be known as other objects are. We take liturgical delight in the fact that God is beyond imagination. He loves us more than we could imagine. Rodriguez observes that we upbraid ourselves after plunging into this abyss, saying, "Lord, where is the love with which I love you? How is it that I do not die for your love?" There's scarcely room for reasoning here. Rather, in an intellectual vision, the light shows the soul all the benefits God has given the soul and body, and they surpass understanding. It would seem to me, then, that the soul's true spiritual environment, different from an academic, scholastic environment, the spiritual environment is not reasoned speculation. The soul's environment should be God himself. So at the end of part one, it seems the answer to the question in my title is no, we cannot do a cataphatic liturgy before an apophatic God. There is no language we could bring to capture God. One of my professors said, theology is like firing where the enemy was last sighted. But by the time you throw your rational net over the sand dune to capture the Lion of Judah, he's already moved on. Summing up with the words of Jean-Baptiste de Saint-Jour, God is not anything the imagination can conceive, the senses grasp, or the understanding of angels or men comprehend. We can neither tame the Lion of Judah with our ritual catnip, nor snare him with our intellectual categories, nor express him with our imaginative contrivances. So, I must be finished. Case closed. Go home. We've got a lot of time for Q&A. Oh, wait a minute. There's a part 2 facing me on the screen. What if we took a different approach to the apophatic? What if apophasis operated differently in liturgy than it does in the library? Apophaticism is usually treated by scholars as a matter of retraction. I mean, a first statement is negated by a second statement. That's why apophatic theology is frequently called negative theology. God is king, but not actually a king. God is powerful, but not the way you're thinking. Some Eastern theologians think Western scholasticism does nothing more than this. Vladimir Lossky complains that Dionysius' distinction between the negative and the affirmative have been combined on a dialectical plane. And so he describes Thomas as having reduced the two ways of Dionysius to one, making negative theology a corrective to affirmative theology. Affirmative theology is the lead end of the pencil, and negative theology is the eraser end of the pencil. And so you write something down, and then you erase it, and then you write something down, but then you erase it again. If they both operate, the positive and the negative, on the same plane, then the one undoes what the other has just done. Dimitri Stanilow also complains that apophaticism gets treated as simple rational negation by the West, in which case it is the via negativa of Western scholastic theology. But in Eastern patristic tradition, apophatic theology is a direct experience. I'll leave aside all the discussion about the accuracy or completeness of the East's assessment, but I do want to follow up on their suggestion that perhaps we should not treat apophasis as a wave that washes away every cataphatic sandcastle we build. That would create problems for liturgical imagination, wouldn't it? Here's something, no, wash it away. The reason for the title of my talk is to propose a fiercer humility before the apophatic God. And the only way to do that is to change, I think, this year I think it's to change the home address of apophasis. If it's housed in epistemology, then we tend to describe it as a kind of ignorance. But if it's housed in liturgy, then the apophatic has a different quality, and the moving van that relocates it to its new address is liturgical abnegation. Here's my thesis in a nutshell, if you were getting tired of listening and you want to take one thing home with you. This does not propose, I know nothing about God, but rather, I am nothing before God. That's abnegation. The hardest apophatic challenge is not an epistemological one. Can we believe the proofs of God's existence? The hardest apophatic challenge is an ascetical one. Will I obey God even though it is beyond my short-sighted reason? While cataphatic theology employs words to say the limited things we can comprehend about God, apophatic theology confesses mysteries of God that we cannot comprehend. And when the soul has dismissed all created things from desire, then she is left with God the All. So here's a second way for me to state my thesis cataphatically. We are brought to the threshold of apophasis not by intellectual negation, but by personal abnegation. It's a rhyming words to try to make it more memorable. Not intellectual negation, negative theology, but by personal abnegation. Nothingness is a mirror that shows us God's apophasis. He who is truly humble is never astonished at his nothingness because he knows it comes from being not God. On my page, I have it spelled with a hyphen, not God. God says, Yahweh. Man must reply, I am not. You are being. My being is on loan from you. Nothingness is a corollary of dependence upon God. And the more total a person's dependence, the more complete the profession of nothingness. So this means to me, nothingness is not a social or moral or personal or psychological or philosophical category. It is, surprise, a category of liturgical theology. My students used to tire of me slapping the adjective liturgical in front of everything. Liturgical cosmology, liturgical anthropology, liturgical. So I finally had to quit. When we speak of nothingness in a liturgical context, we are speaking about the impotency of the creature before the Creator. And that in both the doctrine of creation and the doctrine of redemption. So we admit nothingness not out of self-contempt or shame or disgrace. We admit nothingness in order to liturgize God. With the limited time I have left, I'm trying to get famous for creating the word liturgize. We dogmatize, we rationalize, we theologize. I'd like to talk about liturgizing God and see what I get out of that. Malaville finds a way to put it in the form of a verb. When the soul recognizes, quote, its impotence to do anything for God, it knots itself in his presence. N-A-U-G-H, not K-N-O-T, but negates itself, knots. Chardon summarizes, you are my God, and I am not. Well, who would think that he or she is his God? Well, just about every idolater I've ever met, which is every human being I've ever met in one scale or another. The soul imagines the unimaginable and desires to become what God is. Chardon continues, some will declare this to be impossible and will censure the impertinence of the ardor that prompts such desires. But they should remember that great love is not lessened by that which sets it on fire. Liturgy is impertinent. It may be the most impertinent activity human beings could do. They dare to go before God Almighty and perform this and liturgize Him. It employs intellect, memory, will, and even imagination as a manger for the Christ to be laid in. Peter Amard describes a certain impertinence of the liturgist which does not come from having our understanding changed, but from having our desire inflamed. Quote, God has kindled within you the desire for communion. For if you did not have some desire, however small, you would not dare to communicate. We should veil our eyes before we can do in regard to Him what we would not do in regard to any great person on earth. We invite ourselves to His divine banquet. Hello, Mr. President, I'm coming over to the White House and I'm going to sit at dinner with you. Hello, head of the university, I'm coming to dinner with you. Here, God Almighty, I've invited myself to your banquet. See you Sunday morning on the corner of 5th and Main. Liturgy dares to lay aside its cataphatic imagination in order to approach the apophatic God. I suggest it can be described with the words Blosius uses to explain mystical union with God, which only takes place when a humble and resigned soul is carried above itself. This is a 4-sentence quote. The mind lays aside all, even the most excellent images, and all liquefied by love, and as it were reduced to nothing, it melts away into God. Is that described in any liturgy you've been to? A congregation left liquefied by love? I continue. It is then united to God without any medium and becomes one spirit with Him and is transformed and changed into Him as iron placed in the fire is changed without ceasing to be iron. Here it tastes such delight that heaven and earth and all that is in them seem by the greatness of the consolation to melt away and to be reduced to nothing. Liturgy does not succeed by stirring up our imagination. That would be the talk that I would have given you 10 years ago. It succeeds by leading us to be liquefied by love. This is me channeling the liturgical abnegation people. Well, if we made this shift, if the moving van pulled up and it carried Apophatic from the library to the liturgy, what would be characteristic of the imagination when it is put at the service of liturgy? So I conclude, but I'm only like in the middle, so don't get your hopes up just yet. But I turn to a conclusion of an unorganized train of thought to have something to think about when I return to my retirement castle. I came up with 8 characteristics of liturgical imagination. And I think maybe I could offer them as canons by which to judge whether imagination is being properly deployed in liturgy. By properly deployed, I mean not having somebody who gets a committee together and says, I've got an idea. I know what we could do this Sunday. No, fire them and get them off the parish council. Number 1, liturgical imagination is experimental. It turns out that something is known at the end of apophasis, after all, only it is known experimentally, literally out of experience, ex paritas. I first encountered this different grammar in Orthodox theologians, but my Latin abnegation friends also use it frequently. Here's 5 examples. Francis Lieberman. To know such things, we need to live an interior life. We need the grace of the Holy Spirit and experience. We need an experimental, not a speculative knowledge of Him. Augustine Baker says, union with God gives the soul a fruitive possession of Him and a real experimental perception of His divine presence. Constantine Barbenson says, in this state we await the experimental manifestation of the divine action. Benedict Canfield says, God's inner will is the divine good pleasure made clear by perfect, plain, and experimental inner knowledge. And Jean-Pierre de Caussade says, with a warning shot across the varied careers represented in this room this morning, no one becomes learned in the science of God either by the reading of books or by the inquisitive investigation of history. That which instructs us is what happens from one moment to another, producing in us that experimental science which Jesus Christ Himself willed to acquire before instructing others. So let's just say it bluntly. Liturgical theology is experimental. Have I successfully rescued the word from, let's mess around with it, to an experience of God Almighty? My notion of liturgical theology as theologia prima rests on the assumption that Mrs. Murphy knows experimentally. Be a nice card to write up, wouldn't it? I'm an experimental theologian. Oh, really? What do you do in your spare time? Well, Mrs. Murphy's theology comes out of her experience, not out of her education. And that's why I can call her a true theologian, even if she doesn't have the master's degree. She can taste the God she cannot comprehend. She knows more than she can say. She can feel the God she cannot figure out. Her primary theology is not professional, done with an eye for gain in the academy. It is an amateur, done with an eye of love upon God. I'm not sure I'm happy with this next one, but I'm going to try it anyway. You've been kind to me so far. It doesn't arrive from a stupidity, it arises from a stupere, being stunned. Mrs. Murphy is a theologian. I don't have to argue that Mrs. Murphy is a theologian and prove that she's not stupid. I can set her forward as somebody who has been stunned by God. And so I'd like to listen to her. With this liturgical context, apophaticism is not an intellectual puzzle we regret we cannot solve. It is a liturgical challenge asking us to give our souls over to God. And as a result, the employment of imagination is not restricted to the intellectual faculty. It must affect other spiritual faculties as well. What if imagination in the liturgy was not designed to brace our comprehension of God? It was designed to strengthen our love of God. What if we judged imagination in the liturgy not according to how bright a light it could shine in the mind, but according to how much warmth and affection it could create in the heart? In other words, what if liturgical imagination is not mental but experimental? Then instead of expecting imagination to teach, illuminate, and explain, we would expect imagination to invite us to mystery, create hidden desires, invite affections. Jean-Pierre Camus hopes we might recollect all the powers of our soul, gather them all together, and say to God, I believe. And do it with as much heat of the will as light of the understanding. We were big on light of the understanding. I got a balloon ride out of it for 40 years. But if you could say to God, I believe, with a heat of the will, that would be better. Number 2, liturgical imagination would need to be humble. Gaetano de Bergamo writes, "There are saints in paradise who are neither martyrs, nor doctors, nor contemplatives, nor virgins, but there's not a single one there who was not humble." Start in prayer if you expect a God to guide the imagination. The liturgical imagination isn't designed to dissipate the apophatic cloud. It's intended to embrace the ray of apophatic darkness shining from God. Again, de Bergamo, "Deny yourself to follow me," was Jesus' message, and he concludes that if I will not mortify myself with humility, that is, crush my self-love and craving for esteem, I shall be excluded as a follower of Jesus Christ. Imagination must be implemented in liturgy with humility, not with self-love and self-esteem. And this is a lesson, I'm sorry to say, for liturgical reformers. How much humility do you see in them? This kind of humility comes from telling the truth. Paul Seminary writes, "Humility consists not in thinking we can do nothing for God. If that was the case, the idle, the timid, the pusillanimous, the slothful, they'd be the humblest men in the world. I can't do anything." Humility consists in thinking we can do nothing of ourselves. Because, end quote, "Because we recognize our weakness, we confess God's sovereignty. Because we recognize our helplessness, we confess God's supremacy. Because we recognize our nothingness, we confess God's goodness." So liturgical humility does not grovel, it rejoices. Which is why Bona can say, "This virtue, though it may seem by its very name to denote something mean and small, is nevertheless the virtue of the great. Humility is the virtue of the great, since it is the virtue of the perfect. And it does not lower the mind to base things, it raises the mind to those which are more noble. For while it attributes nothing to itself, it wholly turns to God, believing it can do all things in him by whom it is strengthened. Therefore, humility is brave and magnanimous." So all creative additions to liturgy must stand upon humility. The artist, the advocate, the liturgical activist must be humble. St. Jourde reminds us that Thomas teaches humility to be a virtue which, by the knowledge it gives of the greatness of God and of our misery, represses in us inordinate desires of honor. And it makes us wish to put ourselves, at least in our own estimation, in the lowest place. Number 3, remember there are 8 total, but I'm getting there. Liturgical imagination enthuses. It's designed to awaken a craving, which is how the little liturgy we do within the temple accompanies us as our great liturgy in the cosmos. I don't mean little like not much. I mean small and big. And I stumbled around the thought that the cultic, ritual, sacramental liturgy in the temple is our little liturgy, which is a cog which turns the great cog of our life, and that's our great liturgy. Somehow I'm trying to run an escape plan to get the liturgy out of the confines of the temple and into everyday life. De Loreto writes, "The love of my God, in whom the soul is occupied, is neither cogitable, nor intelligible, nor can our understanding comprehend him, but he can be desired and loved. In no way," I wonder if they wrote this way, in no way can the understanding apprehend him, but he can be apprehended by the affective nature, by the desires and the will alone. Jean Cresset rehearses in his meditations the fact that God is light to the blind, health to the sick, comfort to the afflicted, strength to the weak, sanctity to sinners. That's a pretty good cataphatic list, don't you think? That's a list of God's actions and attributes. And Crasset refers all of these to be sweet words. But then he sighs, "O God and my all, I am weary thinking, reading, reasoning. All that I read, all that I hear, takes up my mind, but it does not fill my heart." Shall imagination and liturgy take up minds or fill hearts? Liturgy should not satisfy our desires. It should create greater desires. It should create a desire for something more than I could imagine. So likewise, liturgical imagination should not repress. It should rouse. Liturgical imagination should create an appetite for deification. And Jean-Pierre de Caussade counsels that even desiring the desire is looked on favorably by God. I found that very reassuring. To pray is best. To want to pray is good. To want to pray is at least something. And a bunch of these, my abnegation friends, speak that way. So I gathered all their quotes and made a little book out of it called Desiring to Desire God. Angelical Press last January. De Caussade counsels, if you do not feel any of these desires, the mere wish to have them, the mere raising of the heart, is sufficient to keep your soul recollected and united to God. So imagination does not represent something not present and for that reason unreal. Imagination represents something still to come, and for that reason, a reality beyond our present limitations. Aymard acknowledges that the essential condition for communion, of course, is being in a state of grace, and yet he laments how often people go to communion half-heartedly and with a very faint idea of what they are receiving. Therefore, that we may avoid this fault, let us consider among the conditions suitable for communion the one that is first and most important in securing to us the fruit of the Holy Eucharist is desire. If you don't want what the Eucharist is trying to give, your bottle will remain capped. Being with God at the Mass should awaken the desire to finally be with God. There are not two liturgies, one in heaven and one on earth. There's one liturgy in heaven and on earth. Number 4, liturgical imagination is epiphanic, epiphany. Jean-Baptiste Lacordaire said, the object of grace, its proper effect, I'm retired, but I haven't lost the fun of thinking a thought of something that I already wrote. I mean, I'm reading this, about to read to you, and that was nice. I like that one. And this is the quote. The object of grace is to prepare us one day to see God and even to see him here below. You want grace? Why? Here's your reason. To prepare us one day to see God and even to see him here below. What? See God? See him here below? Yes, and I do not retract that expression. I confirm it. He says this to the rationalists in Notre Dame in Paris, where he had audiences of 6,000 listening to his sermons. One lone Dominican standing before the crowd. Yes, and I do not retract that expression. I confirm it. I confess to you ingeniously and without metaphor that I see God absolutely as I see you. Well, that's a pretty good description of liturgy, in my opinion. It prepares us to see God one day. But already the soul receives the kiss of the bridegroom, as the canticle describes. And the bride's reaction, Chardon says, is to exclaim, I have laid aside my tunic, I cannot put it on again. I want no images, I want the beloved. The imagination ascends a cultic ladder, but at each step it lays aside its cataphatic tunic. Here's Bossuet's description of the soul's itinerary. Whatever creature your eye lights on, You will only look there for the features of Christ. Step 1. Step 2. But after a while, you will find that even these are so far removed from his reality that you will seek for Jesus himself. There is a time when one begs all creatures to speak to one of Jesus, and unless they speak to us of him, we would bid them to be silent. But afterwards, we prefer silence again. Because if every creature were but tongue and voice for speaking of the beloved, we should not be satisfied. And then Bossuet takes a third step, which surprised me, and I had to read it 5 times and look out the window and then read it again. At last, he says, we ask Jesus to speak to us alone about himself and to fill our silence with his voice. And later on, we find that we must beg even Jesus to be silent. For whatever he tells us is not, after all, himself, and it is himself that we long for. You want Jesus instead of words about Jesus, even if the words about Jesus were coming from Jesus himself. It made me think that liturgy constantly puts itself out of business. Language about Jesus falls silent when we hear him speaking, and then we even surpass that speech when we come to the real presence. I actually think this is related to what Schmemann means by cultic antinomy, but that was another life of mine, and you have to find it yourself. This is the guiding light of symbolism in liturgy. You might wonder whether all this talk about interiority and spirituality puts an end to symbology, a subject liturgiology has studied for decades, but I don't think it is. Henry Collins makes the point for me by looking at the transaction that occurred in the presentation of the Blessed Virgin Mary into the temple. He says God had already entered the gates of her soul and given himself to her, so what was she coming to the temple to do? He answers, to ratify what she had done in her heart long ago. Quote, before she had done it secretly within her own soul. Now she confirmed it outwardly and solemnly in open ceremony. By this act, she did not really belong to God more than before. But here's a description of liturgy. There's an internal liturgy first. Why do the external liturgy? But still, it was sweet to her heart to embody in an external action the vows of her inward self. It was sweet to her heart to embody in an external action the vows of her inward self. For love is never satisfied till by some outward symbol it shall have made itself over to the object of its love. In other words, love will never be satisfied until it is symbolized by liturgizing God. The faithful should come with a secret liturgy in their own souls and confirm it outwardly and solemnly in open ceremony, and they will find it sweet to do so. 5, I better speed up. Liturgical imagination is kenotic. Christ's kenosis is the model for our abnegation. He was the first to live the Christian life. We do not have a glory like his to deny, but we do have a will to deny, which we must do if we want to follow his example of having no desire except for the Father. The will is where real abnegation occurs, and liturgical abnegation must service the will more than the mind. John Eudes says Christ's entire life was a continual kenosis, even if the cross was the greatest enactment of it. And therefore he urges, annihilate yourself often at the feet of Jesus. Annihilate all that is in you and beg him by the great love with which he annihilated himself to use his great power to annihilate our old selves, death to the old Adam, establish himself within us. We should be using Christ's liturgy when we liturgize, not our own. We should honor Christ's objection by joining our objection to his. It's as if kenosis is God's modus operandi on this side of the eschaton. His way among us is one of self-emptying, humiliation, poverty, and abandonment. Jean Gru says we shall not be surprised, therefore, to find incarnational kenosis in each act of Eucharistic kenosis. Quote, already to unite thyself to human nature, thou hast emptied thyself in the incarnation of the majesty of thy divine being. Once more thou dost will to annihilate thyself in the Eucharist, that thou mayest unite thyself to me. To be united to the Trinity is unimaginable for an unrepented sinner. That's our topic, isn't it? Imagination. This is unimaginable, to be united to the Trinity, and that's exactly the union that the liturgy asks the repentant sinner to imagine, attained through prayer, scripture, sacraments, and mystery. In a word, this makes our liturgical life cruciform. The cross is the master blueprint for all imagination we employ, both in the cultic liturgy and for our lived liturgy. Yeah, I stole that from Corbone. Overcoming the world is always more an affair of the will than of the mind alone. Or, as Francis de Sales succinctly puts it, it's better to bear the cross of our Lord than only to think on it. Gosh, these comments hurt somebody whose balloon is floated along thinking about crosses. Well, I take it then that unless the artist bears the cross, he will not properly imagine the crucifix he is attaching to the wall. Unless the musician bears the cross, she will not put the inaudible harmony around which the stars rotate into the melody she's composing. And unless the liturgists in the pew bear the cross, they will find the pattern of liturgy unable to imprint itself upon them. Mary Margaret Alacoque describes the cross as the throne of the true lovers of Jesus Christ. Crosset describes prayer as a fire that is fed with the wood of the cross. Do you have a fire of love for God? There's kindling for it. The wood of the cross is put in you to make that fire brighter. Christ's cross creates liturgy. Christ's cross was his altar. Our crosses become altars too. And I don't just mean the stone one in the church. I mean our crosses, our sufferings, our mortifications. When they're united to his, they're exalted to be of a supernatural kind, and imagination does not turn its eye away from it. We are not to imagine a life without trials. Liturgy does not create a Good Friday tableau for us to imagine. Edward Lean writes, without crucifixion, our souls are always blinded to God. And if we don't see God, we're not saved. Therefore, the whole of Christianity is not expressed in this formula, Christ crucified for us. True Christians rejoice that Christ is crucified in us. We don't come to the Triduum to watch Jesus die. We join Jesus by dying ourselves, and that would mean 7 days before the next 8th day liturgy of liturgical abnegation. That's the higher and harder task for liturgical imagination to abet. Number 6. Liturgical imagination is righteous worship. Abnegation is not denial of sense, bodies, creatures, intellect, memory, or even imagination. Abnegation is the denial of self-love when we use these things. Given our fallen state, all our faculties must be cured, including our imagination. Purity of heart is required for purity of imagination. We imagine false gods, we worship imaginary gods. Worst of all, we imagine ourselves to be gods. I have a few lines in my balloon career of which I'm proud, and I don't know where they come from. They appear on the screen. This was one of them. The fall was the forfeiture of our liturgical career. Adam and Eve were created to be liturgists, and the fall was the forfeiture of that. Worse than idolatry is autolatry, giving latria to ourselves. So true religion will require abnegation, which is why Louis de Ponte says, all religion is founded upon the mortification of self-will. If it lives, religion dies. If religion is to live, self-will must die. Correction of faulty imagination involves a correction of faulty love. Liturgical imagination has only one purpose: to serve liturgy. Liturgy has only two purposes: to glorify God and sanctify man. Man and woman were created as His liturgists to give Him glory, and the divine economy is the story of God redeeming us after we abandoned our cosmic vocation to bring us back to the only activity that would make us happy. Since liturgy must be done with purity of intention, which Barbinson says only happens when our corrupt nature with its worldliness and self-love begins to die, it will then arise adorned with grace and interior light, and henceforth it may converse, dwell in the house of God. 7, liturgical imagination is cosmological. It could use creatures, creation, and nature, if only our worldliness would die. Then we could find God's glory in creatures, not our own glory in creatures. Then we could use them in liturgy to glorify God and not to glorify ourselves. Then we would no longer be gazing at them or at ourselves like a liturgical narcissist. We would be gazing through them at their Creator. So liturgical apophaticism need not result in a Quaker interiority or a Zwinglian iconoclasm, because liturgical abnegation is training the soul to find God in all true, beautiful, and good objects. And it can do so long as the soul does not corrupt their natural inclination to worship God and then misuse those things for autolatry, self-worship. All outward things can be made into stepping stones to rise up into God if we continuously mix thought of the Creator into our thought of the creature. Then, Collins says, the soul passes beyond, through the creature, into the Creator, who is blessed forever. Collins is speaking especially of natural creatures, sunlight and flowers. I'm applying his words to created artifacts, icons, statue, music, vestment, architecture. Marie Eustelle Harpain observes a different gait going up and coming down the ladder of liturgical imagination. She says, saints, instead of ascending the ladder step by step, as if kind of arduously making their way to God, the saints seem to take a bolder flight and to spring up direct to their sovereign good, passing by and overlooking all that is finite. Afterwards, descending, then they ascend to creatures by viewing them in Him whose works they are. But they don't so much see God in creatures as seeing creatures in God. So we will use things seen, heard, touched, smelled, and tasted from the moment God became incarnate. Because Nicholas of the Holy Cross says, among others, I then found the quote in several others, God would link us to Himself by the chains of Adam. Why the incarnation? God wanted to link Himself to us by the chains of Adam. And he goes on to imagine the Creator humoring His creatures by His incarnation. There's a risk of idolatry because human beings are drawn to visible objects. Well, okay, God's love prompted to render Himself visible by taking flesh just to humor our inclinations and to become an object to which we may justly pay the honor of latria or divine worship. Thus, love contrived that His sacred humanity should serve as a bait by which they may be allured to the place their adorations are right. Does the imagination we use serve as sufficient bait in liturgy? Is ours a beautiful liturgy? If I become what I see, and if we're to be deified, then God must let Himself be seen. Crasset concludes, He is the beauty by which all is beautiful. He is the goodness by which all is good. If I love beautiful things, should I not love beauty itself? And 8, wrap this up. Liturgical imagination must adore. We're doing Christ's religion, not ours. We must therefore reimagine Christ's religion, not imagine a religion for ourselves. Jacques Ollier says, adoration is that virtue of religion which inclines the soul. What does adoration do? It's a virtue of religion. What does it do? It inclines the soul to annihilation, adoration, praise, thanksgiving, love, in a word, to all the duties and homages we ought to pay to Almighty God. However imaginatively we do our liturgy, it will only be judged a success insofar as our souls are inclined to adoration. Whatever imaginative, cataphatic imagery of Jesus we create, it must be sacramental, by which I mean Christ must be able to work in it and through it. You have to be able to give it over to him as a tool or instrument. Jesus' liturgy to the Father is the model to imitate in our liturgy, which would be much less difficult if we would just get out of the way and let him work in it. And this is the pure love that the science of the saints tries to teach us. It's a required science for committing liturgy. Glory belongs to God. Man and woman are created as his liturgists to give him glory, and all creatures are created as tools for that purpose. Crasset expresses the connections this way. Glory belongs to God. He gives us all his goods, except that it is the only thing he accepts from us. He gives us all goods, except this, giving glory, is the only thing he accepts from us. He gives us treasures, we give him glory. It's an honor to give something to God. We are in the world to glorify God, for he that gives us life and preserves it. He wishes us to know and to love him, to make him known and loved by all. God does everything for his glory. What an honor to work for the same thing that God is working for. And what injustice to refuse his lawful right. Wrap up a couple sentences. Liturgy is less a knowing power and more a loving power. Therefore, I thought imagination it uses is less a species of knowing and more a species of love. The coin of the realm in liturgy is love. So if we're going to spend our imagination, coin of the realm, spending, get it? I was following through on the joke. If we're going to spend our imagination, it must be the sort that raises the will to love, not just one that stirs the intellect to curiosity. The success of imagination in liturgy will be measured by the degree to which liturgists become more fervent with love for their God. De Sales says, spiritual lovers, I'm thinking of liturgists in the pew now, are you? Spiritual lovers, Mrs. Murphy, who comes Sunday after Sunday after Sunday, spiritual lovers want to cleanse, purify, and beautify themselves, not to satisfy themselves, not to make progress in virtue, but rather, De Sales says, out of obedience to the bridegroom, out of reverence they have for him, out of the fervent desire which they have to please him. Now, is not that a love pure, simple, and unalloyed, since they do not purify themselves in order to be pure? They don't adorn themselves in order to be beautiful, but only to please their beloved. That'd be pretty nice to have a congregation of such liturgists. I thank you for your kind attention and pray for me, a sinner.
David, thank you. So very beautiful. Thank you. We have time now for questions and answers. I invite you to please project your questions.
I'm sorry that happened. I was trying to run so long that there would not be time for Stump the Speaker, which is what the questions usually turn into. So I always modify this slightly, and I ask not, is there anything you didn't understand you'd like him to say again, or challenge him. Don't you think that? I hope that maybe I stirred some thoughts. I'd like to hear the thoughts. So I'm as interested in comments as I am in questions. What were you thinking?
Okay, two things, and speak of either one of them.
The first is just your point about humility, or the rule of humility. And I guess I wonder how you distinguish between an authentic liturgical humility and the sort of false humility, which is really just kind of sort of enforced mediocrity or something like that.
Yeah.
Because that seems to be a kind of contemporary problem. The second is totally unrelated, and it's just I noted a couple of times you use the language of sweetness, which
Not me, but my guys. Yeah.
So and so I think at least one was related to Mary, and I guess I was just wondering about just that idea of taste. You know, because it's just an interesting concept.
Yeah. I've taken a vow to quote Chesterton once a week to somebody somewhere, so I can comment on your second question that way. Chesterton's, is it in his Thomas book or his Francis book? He says the Catholic theology says two things: taste and see. Taste and see. First, you see, and then you could taste it, and then you could see it. They both work. I think that tasting is a common metaphor, and now that you bring it up, it's not a very frequent metaphor for spiritual senses, is it? Aroma and taste are the last two that we get around to mentioning. Sight and hearing, but the smell of Christ coming off the newly baptized, and the taste which allows you to grab something. Don't wander. The thing about humility, there's a great quote by De Sales. Can I find it? No, I don't have time. But he's doing the same thing. There's a fake, obviously fake kind of humility. Oh, not me. I'm just a Christian. That sucks. It's been attributed to C.S. Lewis, but I've looked and looked for it and never found it. He said, false humility is thinking less of ourselves. True humility is thinking of ourselves less. That's great when just two words switch and it works. I've seen it attributed to him, and I've never found it. Somebody has said it. The guys I'm dealing with, the two chapters in what I'd been working on, chapters on humility, make it clear that humility is basically truth-telling. And that means some people's humility, it requires them to step up and risk service to God in His kingdom. Humility means being where God has placed you, living out your spirituality in the state of life in the place where He's put you. It's some goofy, I don't know where it came from, thought that humility means not thinking well of ourselves or much of ourselves. Plays a little too much into Nietzsche's hands. There are tests. De Bergamo wrote a book on humility, and then I just found another one in which it's on the Passion of Christ, and humility shows up all over it. They analyze this. They think about it carefully. I don't think we do humility well at all, but we certainly don't talk well about it either. I mean, it escapes us. To the back.
Columba, Marmion's thought and described, there's a book about his theology entitled The Grace of Nothingness. I'm curious if Marmion fits into this, the schematic that's laid out.
When did he live again? He might fall just outside my 1900s. Marmion did have a significant influence on me. Somebody recommended a book, and so I read everything I could find by him back in the balloon. I'm not picking up here. All the authors I found are recommended to me by other of the authors. I haven't read a secondary study giving me a list of names, but these people quote somebody, so then I go and read that person. Nobody's mentioned Marmion because I think he comes just a little on the outside of it. your quote sounds exactly right, and I'm not surprised. And I will happily go back and look at him and discover that they're all saying the same thing. How can all these theologians, East and West, do we dare go that far? Oh, let's not be too dramatic. Let's just say inside the West. How can they be living centuries apart and be saying the same thing? One year it occurred to me, it's like one digs a well here, and one digs a well in the 17th century, and one in the 19th century, and one in the 14th century. But their wells go down to the same aquifer down below. They pull it up at their own time, but the water they pull up is shared. So I'm never surprised when I find one author confirming something that another author has taught me.
Thank you so much for running. I think you an essay you wrote about liturgy and care for back in the margin. Great essay. It makes me think about the relationship between, it's just called contemplative life and academia. Early modern astronomers like Tycho Brahe and several others, in Galileo, I think thought that ultimately the natural world was incomprehensible, like God. Now, we can comprehend to a certain point, but it seems to me that your emphasis on humility is what is most needed in academy of all, is the awareness of our human limitations. Not only confronting God, but confronting knowledge, and confronting the ability to understand the natural world. And one of the most poignant proofs of that is the problems that mathematics faces in exploring the infinite. I don't know if this is a question or affirmation.
Yeah, I wasn't asking questions. I appreciate the comment. I'll go home and think some about it. You make me think of Socrates, huh? The one who knows that he doesn't know is the one who knows most. One time I get these goofy thoughts, and Socrates wants philosophia, right? Love of wisdom. But he had a problem with the sophists. And it seems like instead of trying to be wise men, they wanted to be wise guys. That's the characteristic of the kind of hubris that goes on even in the natural knowledge, natural world. Maybe those limits are training wheels on our bike to prepare ourselves for the incomprehensible but experimental. Yeah, I'll put those two words together myself out of the talk. God is incomprehensible, but he's experimental. I feel like Wile E. Coyote, experimental genius or something, but that's it. It's out of experience, ex spiritus.
David, just a reflection. Your study in recent years on people from the West was beautiful, it's remarkable, but it sounded to me today, I said, this guy sounds like he's just read Gregory of Nyssa and Evagrius Ponticus on purity of heart. Seems like they say the same kinds of matters, and they're always touched by liturgy. That's their that's the environment in which they live. So it's beautiful to see.
Yeah.
Here we have certain analogies between East and West on very important themes. It's great.
I hope so. It would be nice, in my estimate, to have an ecumenical effort on this plane rather than only on the stickler thorns. There is this common ground. I did a word search through my guys, and I found Dionysius referred to repeatedly by them. I wrote the book on liturgical asceticism using all Eastern authors to talk about the ascetical cost of committing liturgy. This is intended to be volume 2 using all Western, and that there's a connection between the two volumes, East and West. I'm most happy for you to have noticed it. It's intentional, but
I was about to ask you, how do we resolve this tension between spirituality and the academia? And I feel like you answered it when you spoke of the importance of living humbly in terms of living holiness where we find ourselves.
Yeah.
I just thank you for that.
yeah. Strange thought for God to say, I'll put this one in the academy. Let's see how he does with that. That's how it works, isn't it? Paul Holmer was a mentor of mine, and he used to give a lecture I'd heard 3 or 4 times as his TA. People with the highest IQ, intelligence quotient, don't always have the highest spiritual quotient or emotional quotient. He who has the tallest pile of books is not necessarily the holiest person. Books can help. I can find you lots of quotes complaining about books, but then I can find you some quotes that say there's value to this. Because the book is really just a seance. How can I have contact with Maximus the Confessor? Not in my bedroom lighting a candle. Oh, here's his book in the library. Reading these books are like seances with dead people who are still then living and affecting me. So that's a nice gift, as well as Thomas calling the intellect his highest good. I thought, if God does not ignore the prayers of a monk or the works of a saint, maybe he can be pleased with the thoughts of a theologian, of an academic. Maybe they please God. Maybe you could honor God by having this thought. If you went through the hoop of abnegation and it wasn't all for your self-esteem and could I get this published? And you have to abandon that, or else there's no merit to the exercise.
There's always a catch.
Always a catch. Are we there?